So, moving on to the fourth segment for this month's Watching Brief, we have quite a charming story about a pub. A pub in Great Yarmouth which has been listed, Grade 2 listing, due to its Art Deco design. Now, this is where you might want to call me up as a bit of a hypocrite, because actually I find this quite pleasing. I like the design of this building, and I'm like, oh, this is quite nice. And I'm thinking to myself, is this because this architecture is passing out of living memory and into the realm of archaeology a bit more firmly in that sense? But at the same time, I cannot stand other forms of architecture being saved. So I mean, I'm sure you're very excited that the Victoria and Albert Museum is to display Brutalist flats.
To be fair, Mark, to display a bit of Brutalist flat.
A bit of Brutalist flat. Okay.
And that's because it's from the Robin Hood Gardens estate that is loved and hated almost equally by various by people who live there and who admire it as a piece of architecture. The Iron Duke, it's great. I think we're in a slightly different area with the Iron Duke because Art Deco is generally pretty popular.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Antiques Roadshow, you look at the number of Art Deco objects that come on that are, and I think that's the other thing about Art Deco. Art Deco is about a complete lifestyle. You live in an Art Deco house with your Art Deco furniture and your Art Deco tea set, and we're talking about.
You see, I feel as though I've been suckered in. I'm buying into a romantic notion of Art Deco, sort of a simpler lifestyle and all this kind of nonsense. And perhaps I am just being a hypocrite.
Art Deco is a relative. It's a form of modernism, if you like. In some respects, it's got these wonderful clean curves. Visually, it's an attractive way of presenting buildings and objects for many people. Others, me included, think that a brutalist building like the National Theatre or Robin Hood Gardens or is that Students' Union building in the North East, Durham, is it, currently under threat, which is, buildings like that deserve to be preserved in the same way as as some of the best and most interesting. It doesn't have to be universally liked or loved, but if it's peer reviewed, we were talking about publication earlier. If it's peer reviewed as being exceptionally interesting, I think it deserves a shout at being preservation, a chance of preservation.
Yeah, but you see, in the case of the Durham Students' Union, I mean, it has to be a livable building, useful, not like genuinely morbid and dangerous.
And that is a really good point. Actually, in terms of the pub, I don't think there's any question that it wasn't. And this goes for lots of pubs that are being lost at the moment. And this is one of the justifications for listing the Iron Duke. A lot of pubs are being lost because where they were once the centre of communities who went out for a drink of a night. Those communities have either changed so that their social habits have changed, or that they find themselves in areas that have been redeveloped, and they no longer have that audience of users on their doorstep. Everything from, quite rightly, rules on drink driving to the fact that booze is available in the supermarket has completely changed the way people relate to that part of their lives. And so pubs do risk being completely repurposed out of all recognition or even demolished. I mean, the most common one is where a building's seen as viable, it's converted into flats. You get other pubs that are converted into local shops, but they tend to they lose the internal furniture and the external character, and so there is a justification, I think, for trying to preserve certainly the best and the most interesting as viable buildings as pubs. I mean, there's another case of an Art Deco building I can think of, which was in the doldrums for some time, but has been actually sympathetically restored and extended, which is a hotel on the Thanet Way next to what was Manston Airport. And that building now looks very handsome and is working, and but at the same time it's preserved the essence of what made it an interesting and attractive building. I think with something like the Iron Duke as well, there's an underlying, and I don't again, I haven't read the listing in detail. There's another aspect of it which is interesting, particularly at the moment with the centenary of World War One. The postal address is actually Jellicoe Road. Admiral Jellicoe was the commander of the British fleet at the Battle of Jutland, and the Iron Duke, HMS Iron Duke, was his flagship. So you've got the flagship pub on Jellicoe Road. It has that has a resonance. It was built in between the wars, and it's looking back to the Britain's naval hero of World War One.
Okay. Well, and actually, I find myself thinking though now about the future of this building. What comes next? Because just briefly, just as a point of interest, some people might find interesting at home. Pubs did go through that transition, I guess, over the last 50 years. Of being the place to go to get alcohol in particular, but also just to socialise in a public house, pubs, to then having this idea of an off licence where you could buy, usually through like a side door on the pub, you could buy a beer or alcohol and this kind of thing. There were still pubs, for example, around here that are boarded up, but you can see the off licence door. You can see where people would have had to go, maybe in the 60s and 70s, possibly to get their alcohol if they wanted to go home with it. So you're buying it off a licensed premises, I guess was the term. Then the term off license was applied to shops called offies or off licenses, and then more broadly alcohol was being much more freely available in other shops as well. And certainly in my adult life, I've always been aware and been able to get hold of alcohol in supermarkets, for example.
I take it actually the best is that you talk about you being in the northeast.
Careful.
To give a measure of quite how liberal we are in this country now in that respect. A few years back, I was at a conference at Newcastle University, and on the Friday night we went out for a meal with some friends who I was up there with, and we went to a very nice Lebanese restaurant in Newcastle, but the owners were Muslims and it was dry. It must be probably the only dry restaurant in Newcastle that we'd chosen to go to. But we had a wonderful meal, but one of my colleagues came back and was desperate for a glass of wine, and asked, when we got back to the digs, which happened to be the Students' Union, student digs at the university, asking, how can I get hold? Where can I get hold of a bottle of red wine? And told, ring so and so, and it was actually it was an alcohol, it was an off-license delivery service where you could actually phone and get your wine delivered.
We're ahead of the times.
Absolutely, I think the business is probably an absolute winner.
Yeah, that's the northeast of England for you. No, there is that. There is a
so there's
darker...
when you can do that, there's no place for it's a much more difficult place for a building like the Iron Duke. So yeah.
No, yeah, for formal off license in that sense. And yes, of course, there is a darker side to access to alcohol as well.
Yeah.
But I suppose just coming back to this question of the future of this building, apparently it was boarded up for over a decade, closed to the public, and so it's arguably there's been a whole generation of new drinkers, as it were, who just do not see that as the place to go. So they probably can't reopen it as a pub, and indeed, there's nothing that stops it being a pub again. I mean, there are I think Grade 1 listed pubs out there.
Yeah.
You can have a listed pub.
Much so.
But I suppose it's just a broader question of, in terms of the value of listing these sorts of buildings, is what comes next. And I guess I just want to outline this for people who might be interested at home, or who might have a cynical notion that somehow all these buildings, okay, they're saved, but they're never going to actually be used for something ever again, is that often such buildings with community interest, they attract steering groups, don't they? People who help to come up with a plan for the building and come up with the next step and actually decide on how to make it viable again. I suppose what I'm saying is most listed buildings aren't interested. No, most listed status buildings are not empty shells.
That's absolutely right, and in fact, I think it's absolutely right that we're pragmatic about these things. You talked about livable buildings earlier. There's a new Historic England initiative to preserve some at least of the cotton mills from Yorkshire and Lancashire, which are absolutely emblematic of those regions in the 19th century, and some of them architecturally very interesting too. But a lot of them are being demolished for housing, and the idea is that the buildings are actually completely viable but can be repurposed as, for example, flats. So you insert modern flats into those buildings. There is a criticism, and again, there's another development case in London at the moment where this criticism is applied along Oxford Street, which is what's called facadism, whereby you preserve the facade of something and build something completely fine. The argument is, well, at what point do you lose the essence of the building and the importance and the meaning of the building?
So in that instance, just to be clear, they're essentially going to build on that plot, that corner or whatever, and just keep the shell of the building.
That's right.
Outside. So the outer layer, the bricks,
So it maintains the coherence on the street frontage that exists, but behind it is a completely modern replacement building.
Interesting. Well, because actually, and this is where we sort of stray into the realm of architecture and I suppose also art history as well, but definitely architectural history. And so much as there have been vast movements in the history of architecture, post-industrial, pre-modern, which were very deeply concerned about whether or not architecture was honest. The man's name escapes me. The chap who designed Westminster.
Pugin.
That's it, Pugin. Was particularly concerned about Georgian architecture. The fact that Georgian architecture was literally designed to be a facade. All the stuff on the outside, the frilly bits, were reminiscent often of neoclassical designs, but they had no structural purpose. They weren't connected to what was going on inside the building. For example, Pugin's home, I believe he designed from the inside out. So he designed the rooms and then skinned the rooms, essentially. And out of that came a quirky, but in that sense, architecturally honest building. He went on to design, or be commissioned to design Westminster, which had an awful lot of his personal theology and philosophy woven into it, especially when it comes to the role of religion, the Queen as a sovereign and her government, and then the people. So an awful lot of that was going. But my point being is that he was, and architects since him have been particularly concerned about honesty in architecture, form and function, the relationship between the inside and the outside. And so it's interesting how that sounds an awful lot like what you have there is a slightly retrograde step in terms of architectural design, keeping a facade for the sake of it. One could argue is dishonest and pointless. It's in it, and this also relates to my question about the Art Deco pub. In so much as if it is just going to be a vestige, a shell, an empty husk, then there is no real point in keeping it, really.
Except that sculpturally on the streetscape, it's an attractive building, and if you can, I think it was. If it had a particularly well-preserved interior, then you might argue that it's worth trying to find a use that maintains that within the current social landscape of the area, whether it's a restaurant or whatever. At the same time, if the interior is particularly heavily damaged or not particularly notable, then I think it's perfectly reasonable to upgrade, change what goes on inside those walls and windows, and if that again will give the building make the building again a viable part of the local scene, and why not?